Hello everyone, my name is CJ Garcia, and I'm the Liaison and Communications Librarian here at ATSL University. In celebration of Open Access Week 2022, I'll be talking to you today about how to publish your work open access, get involved with open access publishing, and avoid predatory publishers along the way. So today we'll be talking about, what is open access and why do we care about it? We'll talk about the two types of open access publishing, and then we'll take a deeper dive into how to publish your work via both of these routes, including gold open access, where you sort of publish your work in a traditional manner, as well as green open access, where you self-archive your work in a repository. Then we'll talk a bit about predatory publishers and red flags to look out for when selecting a journal for your work. So what is open access? Open access is publishing your research results in such a way that they are both free to access and are free to reuse. This means that not only are there not paywalls around the article, as there is with traditional publishing, but they also have permissive copyright licenses that allow people to reuse the work and build upon it, and really use the work in a way that encourages science and building upon others' work. And so there are a lot of benefits to open access, the first of which is increased visibility, right? By reducing these paywalls, it becomes a lot easier for people to find and use your work. This is particularly important in a global context, as a lot of countries in the global south or from poorer countries don't have as much funding and access to research literature as we do here. And publishing your work open access really helps it reach that wider audience. In the health sciences, that is particularly important because it allows current medical research to reach the whole world and have a good clinical impact at a wide scale. Another important part of this, of course, is that the public can access open access work. This means that the public can be more engaged with research, can kind of see where their taxpayer money is going, and this public can actually include working clinicians. There are a lot of clinicians out there who may work in private practice. Maybe they're not working for particularly well-funded hospitals, or they're in community health centers without a lot of funding. And so a lot of clinicians are working without access to the current medical literature, and publishing your work open access can really help them use the work and find the work and apply current medical research to their practice. All of this together means that open access articles have, on average, greater citation rates than non-OA articles, regardless of the type of open access an article is published in. A lot of research has been done in this area, and it definitely shows that publishing your work open access definitely has a personal benefit, as it really increases your own impact factor and the reach of your research. In addition, one of the primary benefits of open access is it helps to drive innovation. By reducing these paywalls and reducing copyright restrictions, it becomes much easier for people to use the research and build upon it. This is particularly important in a health sciences context. Current research has shown that there is a 17-year gap between when basic research starts in a lab and when that translates into clinical practice at the point of care. Reducing these paywalls helps to accelerate that pace of research and helps to turn research into clinical practice at a faster rate, improving healthcare outcomes. Lastly, of course, an important aspect of open access is that lots of funders these days are requiring open access in some form or another. And so understanding the open access landscape and how to participate in it will help you remain viable when it comes to competitive research funding. And so there are two types of open access publishing that you'll typically hear people talk about: gold open access and green open access. Gold open access is where you publish your work in a journal in a traditional way, it goes to peer review, all of that, but the end result is an open access article that is free to access and is usually published under a permissive copyright license like Creative Commons. In contrast, green open access is where you can publish your work in a subscription-based journal of your choice, and then you can self-archive a version of that article in a repository. Note that there are two different types of gold OA publishing in the traditional sense. One is where you publish in an open access journal, which is a traditional journal, and it does all the things that a journal does, but just publishes all of its work open access by default. The other format is hybrid journals, where it is a subscription-based journal that you may already be familiar with, and the whole journal is behind a paywall, but they may allow select articles to be open access. Sometimes for open access publishing, especially on the Gold OA route, you may need to pay what's called article processing charges, or APCs. You may have also have seen these referred to as author processing charges. And so APCs are essentially fees that journal publishers charge authors to cover the cost of publication and to sort of make up the lost revenue that they would traditionally gain from having a paywall in an article. Overall, these are more common with hybrid journals, though you will also see them sometimes in pure open access journals as well. And so, to go into a little bit more depth about Gold OA publishing and how you can do it, I think it's important to note that there is often this misconception that open access journals are of lower quality, they don't have as good a peer review, they don't have the same prestige or impact factors. But these things certainly are no longer true, at least these days. There are many good, prestigious, high-impact journals out there that you can also publish open access in. This includes both pure open access journals and hybrid journals. There are a lot of open access journals out there that have, good recognition and good impact factors, such as eLife, the Public Library Science Journals, and BMJ Open, just to name a few. Additionally, with the rise of hybrid journals, it's a lot easier these days to publish in the same journals you've been publishing in throughout your whole career, but make your article open access, often by paying an APC to that journal publisher. Now, when it comes to APCs, it's important to know that the vast majority of open access journals, over 70% of them, do not charge any APC whatsoever. However, APCs are extremely common with hybrid journals and with some of the larger open access journals I was just talking about. That being said, just because a journal requires an APC doesn't mean that you have to pay for it yourself. A lot of grant funders these days are aware of the cost of open access publishing and do accept covering article processing charges as an allowable cost in your grant proposal. And so it's important when you're writing your grant that if you know you want to publish open access, to identify some target journals early on and get an estimate for how much such charges might be so you can put that into your grant application. Additionally, it's important to note that the library has deals with two publishers, Wiley and Cambridge, that allow ATSU-affiliated researchers, both faculty, staff, and students, to publish open access in journals from these publishers for absolutely no cost. And if you want to know more about how to take advantage of this, please feel free to reach out to your liaison librarian and we'll set you up with all the information you need to know. Now, I want to take a couple of minutes to just talk about a couple of tools you can use for finding high-quality open access journals when you're thinking about journals you may want to publish in. The Directory of Open Access Journals is exactly what it sounds like. It is an online directory that provides information on a variety of open access journals that have been vetted for quality and are respected by their peers. What this means is that the OAJ is a great tool for identifying potential journals you can publish your work in and have that work be open access. Here you can see that I've done a search for nutrition, saying you're interested in doing research around a nutrition topic, and I just limited our subject to medicine and specified languages that publish in journals that publish in English. And so here you can see we have a list of a number of different journals you may want to consider if you're publishing in the field of nutrition. You'll note that this website has a lot of helpful information, including links to the journal websites, the estimated cost of APCs in those journals, as well as the licensing terms that are applied to articles in those journals. A couple of key features to note about DOAJ is that you have an option here to sort to journals that do not charge APCs. So with one click, you can get a nice, concise list of journals you can target where you don't have to worry about covering for APCs whatsoever. Additionally, you also have the option of searching for only journals that have the DOAJ seal. So this seal is essentially an indicator of quality. It means that the journal has gone through a much more rigorous quality check to have gotten the seal. And it shows that these really are going to be sort of the most well-respected, the highest quality, and sort of the highest tier journals in this subject area that are open access. Bison is a really great, interesting tool that enables you to put the title, abstract, and references of a paper you're working on into the website, and it will use an AI to determine journals that match the scope of the article you're working on. And it does this basically by looking at the articles that have been previously published in a journal and sort of using that to see whether or not your work would be a good fit. And so you can see here that I've just sort of put in an abstract that I pulled from PubMed as an example, and it's pulled up a number of different journals to sort of match the subject area. And one of the great things too is if you click on one of these journals, it comes up with all sorts of helpful information. This includes, average publication time, copyright status, licensing, potential APCs you'll have to pay. So you have, at a glance, all the information you might need to help you determine whether or not this is an article you may want to publish in. In addition, it contains quick and easy links to the journal's websites and author instructions to make it easy to get the information you need. Jane is a very similar tool where you can insert your abstract or keywords, and it will use an AI to identify journals that match that research topic. Here you can see that while this is not limited to open access journals in the way that Bison is, it's really easy to identify open access journals with this orange high quality open access banner. In addition, some other great features of Jane are that you can see at a glance the impact factor of the journals, and you can see whether or not a journal is indexed in Medline. Medline indexing can be an important thing to consider when thinking about what journal you want to publish in, as Medline is not only an indicator of quality, but it also means that your work will be in PubMed and will have more discoverability than if it were published elsewhere. The last tool I want to talk to you about is Publish and Flourish. Essentially, this is a database where you can insert the name of a open access journal, and it will quickly pull up some helpful information for you, including what type of open access it is, its historical APC charging data, and how its impact factor has trended over time. So this is another really great tool that you can use just to get some more information on potential journals of interest to you. Now I want to briefly do an overview of Creative Commons licenses. As I mentioned before, an important part of open access is that they have a more permissive approach to copyright than has traditionally been the case in academic publishing. This means that, in practice, basically all open access journals publish their articles under some variation of a Creative Commons license. So it's really important to understand these licenses so you know what kind of license will apply to your own work. Many journals also allow you to choose what kind of license you want to apply, so understanding the difference will help you make an informed decision. The basis of a Creative Commons license is what we call the CC BY license. This is the plainest Creative Commons license and the most permissive. What this means is that anyone can use your work for basically any reason or to do anything with it, so long as they give you proper attribution as the author of that work. In addition to the space form of the Creative Commons license, there are a couple of other modifiers you can apply and mix together to provide additional limits on how people can use the work. Two of the most common ones are the no narrative works modifier, which basically means that people can, copy and distribute the article, they can read it, but they can't necessarily, do new work based off of that work without prior permission. Now, one important thing to note is that the no derivative works license does not stop people from quoting your work in their own articles, as has been sort of tradition and practice in science for a long time. That is because that practice typically runs under fair use, which is a whole other copyright conversation, but it's just important to note that the no derivative works modifier doesn't limit the traditional pace of science. In addition, another important one is the non-commercial modifier. What this means is that, like the CC BY option, people can use it for basically any purpose. They can reuse it, they can share it, so long as they're not doing it for a commercial purpose. This is often used to sort of keep work being shared and used in academia without necessarily going out into private industry and things like that. Lastly, there is the share-alike license. This one is a bit more complicated. It essentially means that any work created using the original work has to be shared under similar or the same license conditions. So, if you're using a Creative Commons work to create something, that work also has to be licensed in Creative Commons. Generally speaking, I advise people to stay away from share-alike licenses, as they can create a lot of unnecessary complications and make it really hard for downstream users to use the work. Similarly, you won't really see share-alike licenses being used by journal publishers, so that's not something you're likely to encounter. One thing I will note is that CC BY is the most permissive of the licenses and is generally considered the gold standard for making your work open access. Next, I want to talk a bit about how to self-archive your own work, which you may have also heard referred to as green open access. In essence, what this means is that after or before publishing your work in a traditional journal, you will archive some version of that article in an online free repository. Oftentimes, these are either preprints, meaning that they have been, written up and the research has been completed, but the work has not yet been peer-reviewed or submitted for publication. A common preprint repository you may have heard of is medRxiv. Alternatively, many repositories also accept author-accepted manuscripts, which is the version of the manuscript that has gone peer review and been accepted, but hasn't gone through the final typesetting process at the journal. This means that author-accepted manuscripts have a lot more validity to them since they have been peer-reviewed, and they're in a bit more of a finalized form, but they're just not quite the final version of the article showing up in a journal. And while they're a little bit less common, there are repositories out there that accept the final versions of articles. An important one that you're probably familiar with is PubMed Central. PubMed Central is an open access repository, but it actually requires that the final versions of articles be submitted to PubMed Central, and of course it requires that as part of NIH funding. Traditionally, there have been two different types of repositories that you can consider publishing your work in, or archiving your work in rather. The first of these are what's called either subject or disciplinary repositories. Like medRxiv that I was mentioning earlier, these are repositories that have a specific disciplinary focus and accept work related to that research topic. These can be really great for discoverability, as it makes it easy for researchers working in the same research areas to find each other's works. In addition, there is also institutional repositories, which are repositories that will take work from any discipline so long as it's produced by someone affiliated with that institution, such as a university. Here at the AT Still Library, we're currently in the process of launching our own institutional repository, and we do hope you'll consider us for archiving your work. And you can expect more information to come out about that in the coming months. It's important to note that most major publishers will allow some kind of self-archiving, and so even if you don't publish your work in an open access journal, you may be able to take your current work or even your pre-existing work that has been previously published and self-archive it. There are two ways to sort of identify whether or not this is possible. One is, of course, to go directly to the journal or publisher websites and see what they say on their websites, but there's also this great tool called Serpa Romeo, which I'll show here in a little bit, that can really break it down for you and make it easy to identify what your options are. It's important to note that most open access policies that you may encounter are typically require green open access rather than gold open access publishing. This is true, for example, of the NIH open access policy. Like I mentioned earlier, the NIH open access policy does not require you to publish work in an open access journal, but it does require you to make a final version of the article available in their repository, PubMed Central. One thing that you may encounter is that many journals and publishers will have special exceptions for grant-funded work that will allow you to self-archive your work in a way that is consistent with those funding requirements. For example, many journals, even closed access journals, will allow you to deposit the final version of your article in PubMed Central if the work is NIH funded. I want to briefly introduce you to Serpa Romeo, which is a really great tool that you can use to identify your options when it comes to self-archiving your own work. Serpa Romeo is essentially a database where you can type in the name of a journal that you've published work in, and it will very concisely and easily show you all the information you need to know as to how you can archive your work. Here, you can see the New England Journal of Medicine is very well known and respected, but traditional closed access journal. But if you scroll down, you can see here in their policies, there's actually many avenues and ways that you can make your work open access, even if you're publishing with this journal. For example, like I mentioned earlier, you can see here at the top that they have a special policy for NIH-funded research that allows it to be put in PubMed Central after a 6-month embargo. Similarly, they also allow published versions of articles to go into any institutional or disciplinary repository after a 6-month embargo as well. This is very common with Green OA, which is that many articles these days can be self-archived with relatively little fuss, so long as you wait the appropriate amount of time. You can see here that they also have other policies related to other research funders, and they also have a general policy that allows articles, before they're even submitted, to have been published in a preprint repository without issue. So I highly recommend you use Serpa Romeo to see what you can do with your recently published work and your previously published work to make it open access. Lastly, I want to spend some time talking about predatory publishers, what they are, and red flags to look out for when publishing your own work. Predatory publishers are quote-unquote journals who claim to be open access journals, but really aren't journals at all. They don't provide peer review, typesetting, quality control, editorial oversight, or any of the other services that a real publisher would provide. Instead, what they are is essentially companies that charge really high author processing charges to make money without doing any of the work of an editor or a journal, often doing little more than just taking your PDF they submitted to them and putting it somewhere on a website. Of course, the biggest problem with predatory publishers is that they allow bad science to get published because there is not peer review or any sort of oversight on what kind of work is published in these journals. In addition, if you publish your own work in predatory journal, you may run into problems down the line as it can negatively affect your reputation and can trap your article in a bad journal with no impact. I often get questions asking if there are, blacklists of predatory journals, if there's sort of clear guidelines as to what is and is not predatory. Unfortunately, these tools really don't exist in a very good form. There have been various attempts over the years to sort of create lists of predatory journals, but these have traditionally been very problematic, very subjective. And so when it comes to predatory publishing, the best thing you can do is just to know how to identify the red flags and know how to use your best judgment to evaluate a journal and identify whether or not it's legitimate and worth publishing your work in. Some red flags to look out for include journals that solicit you via email for articles or for editorial board membership. Good, high-quality journals have such a high volume of submissions that they don't have the time or energy to go soliciting extra journals from people, sort of cold calling them via email. And so this can be a really big red flag. Another red flag can be really high APCs, particularly if their website is structured in such a way that makes it seem like getting APCs is their primary goal. Oftentimes, predatory journals won't just have APC information, but they may have a link sort of in the top navigation that's, pay your APC here. Traditional journal publishers, while they certainly are charging APCs, are not going out of their way to structure their websites for the purposes of collecting money, as opposed to these predatory publishers who really only exist for that purpose, and it can often show in how they design their websites. Another big red flag to look out for is a lack of clear peer review guidelines. Most predatory journals don't undergo any peer review whatsoever, and that will often show on their websites with the way they talk about peer review, if they talk about it at all. Similarly, if they don't have clear guidelines on retraction or oversight, that could be another red flag, because those are also things traditionally done by a journal that's very important that these predatory publishers simply aren't paying attention to. Another thing to look out for is if it's very difficult to contact the journal editors or anyone from the journal. And another big thing to look out for is if they have a website that's very similar to, but not the same as a major journal. Sometimes predatory journals will kind of dress themselves up like a common journal. For example, earlier we were talking about the New England Journal of Medicine. There may be a predatory journal out there that would call itself something like the New England Medicine Journal, where they may just, change one or two words around to try to trick people into thinking they're another journal. Here on the screen, you can see an example of sort of one of those solicitation emails I was talking about earlier that I was sent at a previous job. Here you can see a number of sort of alarming red flags in this email. First, is the part where it says Dr. Garcia Claudio. That my name is inverted clearly shows that they probably just crawled this information, from a listserv or from a public website somewhere. That they're just sending out mass emails. They're not trying to contact me directly. Another thing is that this information is incorrect. I do not have a doctorate. There's also grammatical mistakes. There's sort of weird formatting. There's the strange color coding that you wouldn't really see in a regular professional email. Another thing you'll see here at the bottom is that oftentimes predatory journals will go out of their way to make it seem like they're legitimate in a couple of ways, even though they're really not putting in that work. For example, this journal has an ISSN number down there, but oftentimes predatory journals will display an ISSN of a different journal and just act like they've been registered. So that's something you can look up on the web and sort of identify whether or not that checks out. Another thing that I recommend doing is taking a look at the Address of the journal. Oftentimes, if you put in the addresses of these predatory journals, into Google Maps and Google Street View, you'll see that instead of, being any sort of office or publishing house, that their public address goes to an empty lot or to a McDonald's, because they don't really have an office. They just sort of chose a random email address off the internet. Think, Check, Submit is a really great tool you can use to evaluate a journal and determine whether or not it's something that you'll want to publish in, and to be sure that it's not a predatory journal. You can reach it by going to thinkchecksubmit.org, and basically what it is it's a checklist that has these guiding questions that are on the screen now, and has additional sort of sub-questions and sub-tasks that will walk you through the process of evaluating a journal to determine whether or not it's predatory or legitimate. Some of these questions including, do you and your colleagues know about the journal? Is it well respected? Is it well known? Or is it sort of come out of nowhere and no one's ever heard about it? Can you easily identify and contact a publisher? Is the journal clear about the type of peer review it uses? Is it being indexed in major services? What does its fee structure look like? What author guidelines are provided? And is it a member of sort of a recognized publishing group? There are two of these I would like to highlight in particular. The first is the question about article indexing. Like I mentioned before, Medline indexing can be a really good indicator of quality, as the NIH does do sort of quality checks to ensure that the journals that are indexed in Medline are, of sufficient quality and produce good science. Now, it's important to note that many major indexing services, such as, Medline, Web of Science, Scopus, Directory of Open Access Journals, oftentimes have requirements that journals have to have been around for a couple of years before they can be indexed. And so, just because something isn't indexed doesn't necessarily mean it's predatory or bad, because it could just be a new journal. That being said, if there's a journal that's been around for, 5+ years and it's still not indexed in Medline or in any other reputable sort of major indexer, then that's probably an indication that there's some sort of deeper underlying issue. Additionally, there are publishing initiatives such as COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, or the Open Access Scholarly Publishing Association, which are essentially consortiums of publishers that sort of act as professional organizations, but also act as an indicator of quality. As to be accepted as a member of one of these organizations, you do have to be a legitimate publisher and have to be accepted by your peers. I did want to just very quickly highlight that the library has both an open access and predatory publishing libguides. And so if you want to learn more about these topics, or if you need a refresher on any of them at any point, you can find both of these libguides on our website. Those are continually updated and checked for accuracy and quality. In addition, of course, if you have any questions, you are welcome to reach out to me or to your liaison librarians for assistance. Thank you.